ladies and gentlemen, imagine this. It's a quiet evening in Fayetteville, North Carolina. A family like any other settles in for the night, never imagining that within hours their world would be turned upside down. Heather Williams, a 25-year-old woman, steps out of her home. A camera captures her last known movements. She gets into a light-colored sedan, a car her family does not recognize, and then she's gone. Now, let me ask you this: if someone you loved, someone vulnerable, suddenly vanished, what would be your first move? Would you check their phone, call friends, race through the streets looking for them? Heather's family did all of that. They tried calling. No answer. Texts went unread. She was simply gone. And just 6 days later, the unthinkable happened. Heather was found dead in a wooded area miles away from home. So what really happened? Who was driving that car? And how did she end up in that forest? Stay with me, because this story only gets more unsettling from here. Before we unravel the mystery, let's talk about the person at the center of it, Heather Williams. Who was she, and why did her disappearance spark such fear? Heather wasn't just another name on a missing persons list. She was a daughter, a sister, a young woman who had been through so much and yet never lost her kindness. But here's something crucial. You need to know Heather had cognitive impairments. Why? A devastating car accident in 2015 changed her life forever. She struggled with speech and mobility issues. Her condition made her vulnerable. She trusted people easily, sometimes too easily. Now ask yourself, if someone was looking to take advantage of another person, who would they target? Someone strong, someone guarded, or someone like Heather, whose innocence made her an easy mark? This is where things get chilling. Because the moment Heather got into that unknown car, the odds were already stacked against her. And the biggest question of all, did she willingly get into that car, or was she lured into a deadly trap? January 4th, 2025. It started like any other evening. Heather was at home on Berkshire Road with her family. Nothing seemed unusual, but by the time night fell, she was gone. How do we know? Her family's Ring camera captured her leaving. And here's where things get eerie. She wasn't just stepping out for a walk. She was seen getting into a light-colored sedan with a sunroof. Now, think about that. Who was driving this car? Where was she going? Why didn't she tell anyone? Her family didn't recognize the vehicle. Heather didn't own a car, and she wasn't known to use rideshare services alone. So let's ask the hard question: was this someone she trusted, or someone pretending to be trustworthy? Think about how many times we've seen stories like this. A young woman, a mysterious vehicle, a moment of hesitation before stepping inside, and then vanished without a trace. Could Heather have been meeting someone? Had she been groomed or manipulated into leaving? Or was this an abduction disguised as a willing departure? And here's the scariest part: that was the last time anyone saw Heather alive. 6 days later, she would be found lifeless in a forest 5 miles away. So now we have to ask, what happened in those missing 6 days? Because whatever it was, it ended in tragedy. Think about this for a second. Someone you love, someone vulnerable, doesn't come home. Their phone goes straight to voicemail. No texts, no social media activity, just silence. What's the first thing you do? Call them? Drive around searching? Check with their friends? Heather Williams' family did all of that. And when she didn't answer, panic set in. Why? Because this wasn't just a case of someone running off on their own. Heather wasn't capable of doing that. She had cognitive impairments. She had difficulty speaking. She trusted people easily. And yet, on January 4th, she was seen willingly getting into a mysterious car, and then nothing. Now, let's pause here. If she was meeting someone she knew, why didn't she tell her family? If she was going somewhere safe, why didn't she call back? If she wasn't in danger, why did her phone go straight to voicemail? Something wasn't right, and the longer the silence stretched on, the worse their fears became. At what point do you stop thinking maybe she'll be back soon and start believing something terrible has happened? For Heather's family, that moment came almost immediately. And they were right. Now let's talk about time. Because when someone goes missing, every hour, every minute matters. Heather was considered endangered from the start. She wasn't just a missing adult, she was a missing, vulnerable adult. That changed everything. The Fayetteville Police Department didn't wait. They classified her as a critical missing person and launched an immediate search. Flyers went up, social media posts flooded local groups. Concerned neighbors started searching on foot. Here's where I want you to really think about something: how important is community involvement in cases like this? Because let's be real, police alone can't find every missing person. It's the watchful eyes of the public that make the difference. Imagine you're scrolling through Facebook and you see a post about a missing person. Do you share it or do you keep scrolling? Heather's case proves that every single share, every single tip, every single person looking at that flyer could mean life or death. But despite the efforts of her family, police, and the community, 6 days passed. 6 long days. And then they found her. January 10th, 2025. A wooded area, quiet, isolated. The kind of place you don't just stumble into by accident. And then a body. Let me ask you, what's worse? Not knowing where a loved one is, or knowing and realizing your worst fears were right? Heather Williams was found lifeless in a remote wooded area near Newark and State Avenues, 5 miles from home. Her family's nightmare had become a reality. But here's what doesn't make sense. How did she get there? Why did she get there? And who took her there? Now, let me remind you, Heather had mobility issues. Walking long distances was difficult for her. So ask yourself, could she have ended up here on her own? Or did someone take her there? And if they did, why? This isn't just a disappearance anymore. This is a crime scene. And someone out there knows exactly what happened to Heather Williams. The question is, will they come forward? Or will the truth remain buried in those woods? Now that Heather's case had turned into a homicide investigation, detectives had one priority: who was behind the wheel of that car. Think about it. The last time Heather was seen alive, she was getting into that light-colored sedan. That car and whoever was driving it was the key to everything. So, what did police do first? They started by retracing Heather's steps before her disappearance. They pulled phone records, checked security footage, and conducted interviews. Every second of her last known movements had to be accounted for. But here's where it gets frustrating. Heather's condition made it difficult for her to use her phone consistently. She didn't text often. She rarely used social media. That meant less digital evidence than usual. So, detectives asked a crucial question: if Heather didn't actively plan this meeting, then who reached out to her? And that's when something suspicious appeared in her call logs. A name kept coming up. A man she had been in contact with before she vanished. Who was he? And why hadn't he come forward? That's when investigators started looking into Tyrell Siermons. So let's break this down. Who was Tyrell Siermons? And more importantly, how did he know Heather? Here's what we know. Siermons was 30 years old, 5 years older than Heather. He had a criminal history. He had been in contact with Heather shortly before her disappearance. But how did their paths cross? This is where things get unsettling. Heather, being trusting and kind-hearted, often spoke to people online. Friends say she liked making connections even with strangers. Could Siermons have taken advantage of that? Had he gained her trust just enough to convince her to meet him? And if so, why? What was the real reason Heather got into that car? Did she think she was meeting a friend? Or was she lured into something far more sinister? Now, let's pause for a second. This is something we see way too often. A young woman trusts the wrong person. A meeting turns deadly. And suddenly, another family is left searching for answers. But here's what makes this case different. Police weren't just looking for a suspect. They were sure they had found him. And on January 16th, they made their move. January 16th, 2025. After days of relentless investigation, Fayetteville police arrested Tyrell Siermons. The charge, first-degree murder. Now, let's be clear, police don't make an arrest like this without solid evidence. So, what did they have on him? Let's break it down. Phone records. Detectives uncovered that Heather had communicated with Siermons multiple times before she vanished. The car. The description of the light-colored sedan matched a vehicle associated with him. Location data. Police were able to place him near the area where Heather's body was found. But the biggest question of all, why? What was his motive? Was it a robbery gone wrong? Was there an argument that turned deadly? Or was this something far darker and more calculated? Police haven't released full details yet. But one thing is clear, Heather didn't deserve this. And now the fight for justice begins. When the news broke that Heather had been murdered, the community was already in mourning. But when they found out who was responsible, shock, anger, fear. Imagine living in a neighborhood where you wave at your neighbors every morning, where you feel safe walking down the street, and then you realize that a cold-blooded killer was living among you. That's exactly what happened in Fayetteville. So, how does a community move forward after something like this? How do you trust strangers again when one of them took the life of a young woman? How do parents protect their children from dangers they never even saw coming? How do you make peace with the fact that this could have happened to anyone? It's not just Heather's family that's grieving. It's everyone who saw her face on missing posters. It's everyone who searched for her. It's everyone who hoped she'd come home safely. Because now they know the truth, she was never coming home. So, what happens next? The legal system takes over. But if you've followed enough cases like this, you know justice isn't always guaranteed. And that's where things get complicated. Let's take a step back. Who exactly is Tyrell Siermons? And what kind of person could be capable of something as horrific as this? When police arrested him on January 16th, they didn't just bring in a random suspect. They brought in someone with a criminal history. Now, here's the real question: should he have even been free in the first place? Let's break it down. Siermons wasn't new to law enforcement. He had a record including previous criminal charges. He had an out-of-state probation violation, meaning he was already on the radar of authorities for breaking the law in another state. So let's ask the hard question: why was he even walking free? This is something we see all the time. A violent offender with a history of criminal activity is allowed to roam freely. And then another victim, another family destroyed, another life lost. Could Heather's death have been prevented if Siermons had been properly monitored? It's a gut-wrenching question, and the worst part, we'll never really know. But one thing is for sure, he should have never been in a position to hurt Heather in the first place. And now Fayetteville is demanding answers. When the news broke that Heather had been murdered, the community was already in mourning. But when they found out who was responsible, shock, anger, fear. Imagine living in a neighborhood where you wave at your neighbors every morning, where you feel safe walking down the street, and then you realize that a cold-blooded killer was living among you. That's exactly what happened in Fayetteville. So, how does a community move forward after something like this? How do you trust strangers again when one of them took the life of a young woman? How do parents protect their children from dangers they never even saw coming? How do you make peace with the fact that this could have happened to anyone? It's not just Heather's family that's grieving. It's everyone who saw her face on missing posters. It's everyone who searched for her. It's everyone who hoped she'd come home safely. Because now they know the truth, she was never coming home. So, what happens next? The legal system takes over. But if you've followed enough cases like this, you know justice isn't always guaranteed. And that's where things get complicated. Now that Siermons is in custody, the fight for justice begins. But let's be real, getting a conviction isn't as simple as we'd like to think. Here's the reality of murder cases. Even when a suspect is arrested, prosecutors still have to prove that he actually committed the crime, that the evidence is strong enough to hold up in court, that there is no room for reasonable doubt. So, what challenges might they face? Motive. Why did he do it? Was this a planned murder or did something go wrong? Evidence. How strong is the case? Do they have forensic proof linking him to the crime? Defense strategies. Will his lawyers try to blame someone else? Will they claim Heather got into his car voluntarily? This is where cases can fall apart. If prosecutors can't prove exactly how Heather died, Siermons could try to weasel his way out. And let's be honest, that thought alone is terrifying. Because after everything Heather went through, the worst possible outcome would be for her killer to walk free. So, what do you think? Will justice be served? Or will this case become yet another failure of the system? Because the truth is, this isn't just about Heather anymore. This is about everyone who's ever lost someone to a crime that could have been prevented. And what happens next? Well, that's up to the court. And let's just hope they get it right. Now, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of Heather's family for a moment. Imagine waking up every day knowing that the person you love isn't coming back. Imagine feeling the weight of unanswered questions, the frustration of waiting for justice, and the unbearable pain of wondering if more could have been done. How do you even begin to move forward? Heather's family isn't staying silent. They can't. They've taken to social media. They've spoken to news outlets. They're pleading with the public, if you know something, say something. But here's the hard truth. People are afraid to speak up. Why? Some fear retaliation. Some don't want to get involved. And some think it's not my problem. But here's the thing, it is our problem. Because silence protects murderers. And every time someone holds back information, another family is left in limbo, waiting for justice that might never come. So let me ask you, if this was your sister, your daughter, your best friend, would you stay silent? Or would you fight until the truth was known? Heather's family has made their choice. They're fighting. And they need all the help they can get. Now, let's talk about something that changed everything in this case: technology. Think about it. How many times have we seen Ring camera footage crack a case wide open? In Heather's disappearance, the biggest breakthrough came from that one piece of footage, her getting into that car. Without it, police might have had no idea where to start. But here's the question: how big of a role does technology play in solving crimes today? Doorbell cameras are catching criminals in real time. Cell phone pings are placing suspects at crime scenes. DNA databases are solving decades-old cold cases. 20 years ago, cases like Heather's might have gone unsolved. Today, technology gives victims a voice. But there's a flip side to this. If everything is being recorded, why do so many criminals still believe they can get away with it? Is it arrogance, stupidity, or do they think they're too smart to get caught? Whatever the reason, one thing is clear: in the digital age, justice is harder to escape. And in Heather's case, that camera footage might be the key to locking her killer away forever. By now, Heather's story has spread beyond Fayetteville. Her face has been shared thousands of times. News outlets have covered every development. But here's what we need to ask: does public awareness actually make a difference? The answer? Absolutely. Here's why. The more people who know, the harder it is for the guilty to hide. Social media pressure can push authorities to act faster. More attention means more tips, more leads, more justice. But beyond that, it prevents the next Heather. Because every time we hear a story like this, we become a little more aware, a little more cautious, a little more determined to protect those around us. So, what lessons can we take from Heather's case? Look out for the vulnerable. If someone you love is trusting, teach them to be careful. Take every disappearance seriously. The first few hours can mean life or death. Share missing persons cases. You never know who might hold the missing piece of the puzzle. Because the next story, like Heather's, it doesn't have to end this way. So here we are. Siermons has been arrested. The evidence is being prepared. But now comes the real battle, the trial. And here's where things can get complicated. Will his defense team try to discredit the evidence? Will they claim Heather went with him willingly? Will they argue lack of intent to lessen the charges? Because here's the harsh reality: cases like this don't always end with justice. We've seen it before. Strong cases crumble in court. Murderers walk free. So I'll ask you this: do you believe the system will get it right? Or will Heather's family be forced to live with the unthinkable? Only time will tell. Let's take a step back from the legal side and focus on something more personal. Heather was vulnerable, and unfortunately, predators look for that. So the question is, how do we protect people like Heather? Should there be better monitoring of individuals with cognitive impairments? Should vulnerable individuals be taught to recognize danger? Do communities need to do more to keep people like Heather safe? Because this isn't just about one woman. It's about everyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. And if Heather's case can teach us anything, it's that trusting the wrong person can be fatal. Let's talk about another huge issue here: online safety. It's believed Heather met Siermons online. And let's be honest, this is becoming an all too common story. A young woman meets someone online. They seem nice, they seem trustworthy, and then they vanish. So, how do we protect ourselves? Verify who you're talking to. If something feels off, trust that instinct. Never meet someone alone. Always have a backup plan. Understand that not everyone is who they say they are, because one bad decision can change everything. Heather didn't deserve what happened to her, but maybe, just maybe, her story can serve as a warning to others. Now, I want to ask you something. What does closure really mean? For Heather's family, does closure mean seeing Siermons locked away? Does it mean getting every single answer about what happened? Or does it simply mean finding a way to keep living, even when the pain never fully goes away? Closure is different for everyone. And sometimes the harsh truth is there is no closure. There is only acceptance. And that might be the hardest thing of all. Now, let's bring this full circle. Heather's story is a tragedy, but it doesn't have to be just that. It can also be a lesson. So, let me ask you, how can we protect the vulnerable in our communities? How can we make sure justice is actually served? How can we make sure this doesn't happen again? Because at the end of the day, we have two choices. We can hear this story, feel bad for a moment, and move on. Or we can learn from it. Heather Williams didn't deserve what happened to her. And the least we can do, make sure her story isn't forgotten. Because if we remember, if we stay vigilant, maybe, just maybe, the next Heather gets to come home.